I mean, think about it applying to yourself. If you know about something, want to stop that something, and are able to stop that something, it seems like you will stop that something. If I know about it, want to stop it, and can stop it, I will stop it. And that seems to apply equally to God. If God can stop all suffering, is aware of it all, and wants to stop it, then God certainly would stop all the suffering. But if we just look around us, we see that there is a tremendous amount of suffering in our world, like all we just mentioned before. So there's actually a formalized version of this. If you turn to page 369 of our textbook, there's a shorter version, or sorry, it's 370 of the textbook. As I state it, I wanted to be a little bit more careful about it. If there's an all-powerful God, then that God can stop all suffering. If there's an all-knowing God, then God's aware of all suffering. If there's an all-good God, then God wants to stop all suffering. That's just spelling out those three qualities of God and the consequences of those qualities of God in greater detail. Premise 4 is combining those all up. If there's a God that has all three of those qualities, an O3 God, then there would be no suffering, because God would stop all the suffering. Premise 5 says, but there is suffering in the world, so our conclusion is that there is no O3 God. Well, there's the argument. What do you think? Is that a good argument? Is that really good evidence that there is no God? Let's turn and evaluate it now. And remember, when we evaluate an argument, we always do two things. We check the structure, and we check each individual premise to see whether it's true. Let's check the structure first. Do these premises, if true, provide us with enough logical evidence to lead us to that conclusion that there is no O3 God? All-powerful means you can stop. All-knowing means you're aware of it. All-good means you want to stop it. So all three combined means there would be no suffering. God would stop it all. But there is suffering, so there is no God that has all three of those qualities. What do you think? Good structure? Bad structure? Why? Well, this structure seems to be good. In particular, all you really need is premise 4 and premise 5. If there's an O3 God, then there would be no suffering, but there is suffering, so there's no O3 God. That's a standard, decent, if-then type of conditional argument. If this is true, then this would follow. The second thing isn't happening, so the first thing can't be true. Very good structure, we like that. If you don't believe it, go back to our first handout on evaluating arguments in general. One of the arguments had that structure, and it was a good structure. The other thing about this is that why do we care about those first three premises? Well, those first three premises seem to provide pretty decent evidence for premise 4. If something can stop, is aware of it, and wants to stop something, then that something would stop all that stuff. So premise 1, 2, and 3 seem to provide pretty legitimate support for premise 4, at least at first glance, anyway. So let's move on to each individual premise. Let's check premise 1. What about being all-powerful? If God's all-powerful, then God can stop all suffering. True, false, questionable? What do you think? I don't know, this seems almost true by definition, right? If there is an all-powerful God, then that means God is capable of doing anything. Well, I suppose by anything, I mean anything that's logically possible. God can't do the impossible. God could have created a world without suffering. That seems pretty obvious, right? Couldn't God create a world that was perfect, was a paradise, where there's absolutely no suffering at all? A world like we imagine heaven to be, at least how religious people imagine heaven to be. It seems like God certainly could have done that, right? And God certainly could prevent any suffering if God wanted to. Premise 2, then, if there's an all-knowing God, then God is aware of all the suffering. What do you think? True, false, questionable? Is God all-knowing and aware of it all? This also seems true. If God really is all-knowing, that means God knows literally everything. And that means God would be aware of everything. It's not like you could sweep something under the rug or hide some of that suffering in a place where God didn't notice it. If God's literally all-knowing, then God knows all and God sees all. So that seems true as well. All right, moving on to premise 3. If there's an all-good God, then God wants to stop all suffering. What do you think? Is that true? An all-good God would want to stop all the suffering out there? True, false, or questionable? This seems to be the one that lots of people want to attack. People call this questionable because it's not obvious that an all-good God definitely wants there to be no suffering in the world at all. In fact, maybe an all-good God has a really good, legitimate reason to allow suffering in the world. Maybe the suffering is there and it serves some really useful purpose that God knows about and sees ahead of time and realizes, there's a reason I'm allowing this suffering, and it's a really good reason. It's a justified reason. So we can compare this. This is a bit of an analogy just to get us started. Parents, in some sense, don't want their children to suffer, but it's not that parents want to stop all the suffering that their children have. Sometimes parents have really good reasons for allowing their children to suffer a little bit. So, example, if your child does something wrong, maybe you want to punish that child by, sending it to bed without dinner or something like that, or giving it a timeout. Or maybe you don't want to spoil your child by literally giving your child everything at once all the time. Maybe you think there's something important as far as building character, to sometimes not buying your child that toy that your child wants so badly. And in some sense, you're causing the child to suffer when your child says, I want that toy, and starts crying, and you don't buy that toy for your child. You're causing the child to suffer. But there seems like there's a good reason to do that. You have these long-term legitimate reasons for causing your child to suffer in the short term. So maybe something similar is going on in the God case. God wants us to suffer sometimes in these small doses, perhaps, in order for us to, learn from punishment or learn from our mistakes or build character or all sorts of potential reasons out there. So moving on then from that questionable premise, let's check premise 4. If there's an O3 God that has all three of those qualities, all good, all powerful, all knowing, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, then God would stop all the suffering. There would be no suffering out there. What do you think? Is that true? False? Questionable? That one seems questionable as well. First and foremost, we mentioned already in the structure that premise is logically supported by premises 1, premises 2, and premises 3. So it seems like since premise 3 is questionable, and we're getting logical support for premise 4 from premise 3, we should also snag premise 4 as questionable as well. Maybe an O3 God has a legitimate reason to allow some suffering. In particular, a reason to not stop all the suffering out there. The other thing I want to point out here is that the logic here is not necessarily airtight. Premise 1, 2, and 3 amounts to saying that God can stop, is aware of, and wants to stop all the suffering. But just because I can do something, I'm aware of it, and I want to do something, doesn't mean I always will do that thing. In particular, I may have a general desire to do that, but I may also have overriding reasons not to do it. So, just an example for my everyday life, I can eat donuts whenever I want. I'm aware of where donuts exist. I can just sort of throw a stone in any direction and find a Dunkin' Donuts. And I, in general, want to eat donuts pretty much all the time. I really like donuts. But that doesn't mean I will eat donuts all the time. I have a really good reason to not eat donuts all the time. I don't want to be so unhealthy that I wind up dying from eating unhealthy donuts throughout all my life. So even though I can eat donuts, I'm aware of where donuts are, and I want to eat donuts all the time, doesn't mean I will eat donuts all the time. I have a really good reason to eat donuts, they taste good, but I have a stronger reason to not eat donuts all the time, that reason being I want to be healthy. So just because you can, you're aware of, and you want to, doesn't mean you will. So premises 1, 2, and 3 might not be the best evidence in support of premise 4, as we maybe first thought when evaluating the argument's structure.